Last February, Lydia Marsh stood at the Walgreens pharmacy counter on El Dorado Street and quietly told the pharmacist, "Actually, skip the blood pressure ones. I'll come back for those." The pharmacist didn't blink. Lydia drove home with Frank's pills and without hers, and told herself it was fine. It was just 1 month. She'd manage. Today, she's back at that same counter, and she puts everything in the basket. Her pills, Frank's new supplement, and a chocolate bar she stopped buying last summer. She pays with her debit card. She doesn't run the math in her head first. That's new. Before she got here, she was burned on a restaurant pitch that never happened. She stopped speaking to her son for 5 weeks, and her oven died at 8 o'clock the night before the biggest order she had ever taken. Here is how it happened, and here is what she learned. Friends, drop a comment. Where are you from? And does your social security check actually last till the end of the month? We'd love to know who's listening. And hit that like button so this story reaches someone who needs to hear it right now. The Walgreens on El Dorado Street smelled the way all Walgreens smell. Hand sanitizer and plastic packaging, and something faintly floral from the greeting card aisle. And Lydia knew the layout by heart because she had been coming here every month for 3 years. The pharmacy was in the back, past the vitamins and the seasonal display, which in February held a diminishing rack of heart-shaped boxes at 30% off. She picked up Frank's prescriptions, 4 of them, a paper bag with his name printed in that particular pharmacy font that looked like it was designed to be unreadable. And then the pharmacist slid her own 2 boxes across the counter. Amlodipine, lisinopril. Blood pressure, 7 years running. "Actually," Lydia said, "just the 1 bag today. I'll come back for those." She said it the way you say something you've rehearsed. The pharmacist nodded and slid the 2 boxes back with the smooth indifference of someone who had heard every version of "not today." Lydia paid for Frank's bag, tucked it under her arm, and walked out through the automatic doors into the February cold. In the car, she sat for a moment, with both hands on the wheel before starting the engine. The heater took 90 seconds to produce anything warmer than cold air, so she sat and waited and looked at the Walgreens sign and thought, 1 month. She would manage for 1 month, and then things would sort themselves out. Things had a way of sorting themselves out. Things had not sorted themselves out in the 3 weeks since Frank came home from the hospital, but the thought still had the quality of a belief, and beliefs were harder to surrender than money. At home, she parked in the lot behind the building, carried the bag up to their apartment on the 2nd floor of a brick building on West El Dorado, and set it on the kitchen table next to the folder she had been avoiding since breakfast. The folder was green, the kind you buy at the dollar store, and she had been using it since January to hold receipts, statements, and the paper on which she wrote her monthly budget in a hand so small and precise it looked like a different era, which it was, in a way. She had learned to write like that in the 60s, in a school that still believed in penmanship. She sat down, opened the folder, and looked at the numbers. Social Security, hers, $1,420. Social Security Disability, Frank's, since the stroke in January made him eligible for SSDI, $1,180. Total income, $2,600 a month. Rent on the 2-bedroom, $780. Frank's prescriptions, $610, which had gone up in January when his cardiologist added a new anticoagulant. Groceries for 2, $920, and that was buying Aldi brand where possible and going to Kroger on Wednesdays when the senior discount applied. Utilities, phone, the internet bill she kept because Gary called on video, $240. Total outgoing, $2,550. Balance, $50. Lydia looked at the $50 for a moment, then wrote below it, in smaller numbers, amlodipine plus lisinopril, $175. She drew a horizontal line through those numbers with a red pen. The line was very clean and very straight, the way lines are when your hand is steady, because you have already decided. She closed the folder, opened it again. From the back pocket, she pulled a printout. Frank's pharmacy called that morning with an updated summary. The anticoagulant had been bumped to a higher dose, and the new tier pricing put it at $68 more per month than the old amount. She crossed out 610 and wrote 678. Recalculated. New balance, minus $28. From the living room came the sound of Frank's wheelchair, the slight squeak of the left wheel that she kept meaning to oil, and then the familiar soft collision with the doorframe. The apartment doorways were standard width, and the wheelchair was standard width, and they did not quite agree. She heard him rock back and try again. She put the folder face down on the table and went to help. Frank Marsh had been an engineer at the Caterpillar plant in Decatur for 31 years and had always moved through the world with the deliberate efficiency of a man who disliked wasted motion. The stroke had taken the right side, his right hand, most of his right leg, most of his speech. What remained was his left hand, which was strong, and his eyes, which were the same eyes they had always been, grey, patient, and in the habit of watching Lydia when she thought he wasn't paying attention. She helped him through the doorway and brought him to the table. He looked at the folder, which was face down, and then at her. "Oatmeal's on," she said, which wasn't an answer to the question he hadn't asked. She made his oatmeal with water and no butter. Butter was one of the things that had quietly left the grocery list in January, along with the chocolate bars she used to keep in the cabinet above the refrigerator and eat one square at a time after Frank was asleep. She put the bowl in front of him and stood at the counter with a cup of coffee and listened to the radio. The weather forecast for central Illinois in February: overcast, high of 22, wind chill making it feel like 8. The kind of cold that doesn't make news anymore once you live here long enough. Frank ate slowly, working the left side of his mouth. The right side of his face was still partly slack from the stroke, the right corner of his mouth sitting lower than it used to, which gave him an expression that looked skeptical even when he wasn't trying to be. She had stopped noticing it in the way you stop noticing the sound a refrigerator makes. That evening, Gary called at his usual time, Wednesdays, around 9. Lydia let it ring twice before answering, an old habit, and his voice came through with the specific, tired quality of a man who had been rehearsing a conversation and wasn't looking forward to having it. "Mum, how's Dad?" "The same. They raised his anticoagulant." "How much?" $68 more a month." A pause. In the background, she could hear the television. Cartoons, which meant his daughter Emma wasn't in bed yet. Emma was 8 and still young enough to have cartoons at 9 o'clock. "Mum, I need to tell you something. Cheryl's pregnant. 12 weeks. Lydia was quiet. The first thing that moved through her mind was not congratulations. It was the arithmetic of what that meant for the money Gary sent each month, which wasn't much, but was something, and which she now understood would stop. She felt ashamed of thinking it, and the shame made her quiet longer than she intended. "Mum? I heard you. Congratulations." "Thanks. The thing is, Cheryl's not working right now, and with the new baby coming, I can't—" "I understand. And I've been thinking, Mum, there's a really good place in Springfield, a rehabilitation facility. They specialize in stroke recovery. It's not like a nursing home, it's more like—" "Gary, just listen. He is your father." "I know that. But you're 70 years old. You're managing everything alone. Your blood pressure—" "My blood pressure," she said, "is fine." "Mum, good night, Gary." She put the phone down on the counter and didn't move for a moment. From the living room, quiet. The squeak of the wheelchair wheel, very slow, moving towards the doorway. Frank had heard. The walls in the apartment were the kind of thin that made everything that happened in one room a matter of public record in the other. She didn't go to him. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the parking lot. Someone was scraping ice off a windshield under the sodium light, working at it methodically, and the scraping sound carried through the glass. She went to bed at 11 and lay awake until nearly 2, running numbers that didn't add up, no matter how she arranged them. $50 minus 28. Buy less of this, skip that, eat more eggs. It kept coming out the same. Around 2, she got up, went to the kitchen, and without planning to, started making dough. It was something she had always done when she couldn't sleep. Not a decision, more like weather. Her hands went to the flour before she had finished deciding to bake, and then she was at the counter in the dark kitchen with the under-cabinet light on, measuring and mixing. She had made bread all her life, the way women of her generation made bread. But the specific bread she made now, rye sourdough, slow fermented, the kind that took 3 days from starter to table, she had learned to understand at Allied Grain and Baking Company, where she worked in the quality control lab from 1976 until the plant closed in 2010. 34 years in the fermentation lab. She had tested cultures, logged pH levels, timed proofing cycles. She knew what made a starter healthy and what made it fail. Knew it the way a doctor knows a patient's chart. She had never thought of this knowledge as valuable. It was just the job. The same as knowing how to operate the HVAC system at Caterpillar was just the job. And neither Frank nor Lydia had ever thought to price what they knew. While the dough rested, she went to the hall closet, looking for a heavier sweater. The apartment was cold at night. The building's boiler ran on a cycle that seemed designed for a milder climate. And saw the box on the top shelf. A small cardboard box with a masking tape label in Frank's mother's handwriting. Recipes, kitchen. Ruth Marsh had died in 2003, and the box had travelled from Ruth's house in Kankakee to 3 different apartments before landing here. Lydia carried it to the kitchen table. Inside, index cards in a rubber band, some handwritten, some typed on a typewriter whose ribbon had been running dry for years. She went through them. Apple cake, pickled beets, a pot roast that required a Dutch oven and 3 hours. Near the bottom, water-stained, slightly warped, a card in different handwriting, older and more formal. At the top, Rye Starter, Grandma Marsh, 1941. She read it in the under-cabinet light. The writing was careful and specific. Flour type, water temperature, timing. And then, halfway through, the card had been torn. Not torn carelessly, torn straight across, as if with scissors or a ruler. The instructions stopped mid-sentence. Feed it every morning. That was it. The rest was gone. Lydia turned the card over. Blank. She set it on the table next to the dough bowl and looked at both of them for a moment. On the counter above the stove was an old Maxwell House coffee can with a plastic lid, the large kind, the 32-ounce. It had been empty since November when she finished the last of the coffee she'd bought on sale and switched to the cheaper store brand. The can had stayed on the counter because she kept meaning to use it for something. She hadn't used it for anything yet. In the morning, Lydia's downstairs neighbour, Doris Kimball, knocked at 8:15. Doris was 66, a retired city bus driver, the kind of neighbour who knew the building's business and transmitted it the way a radio tower transmits signals, continuously and without particular intention. She had been the one who brought a casserole when Frank came home from the hospital, and she was the only person in the building who never asked how Lydia was managing, which Lydia had decided was either incuriosity or wisdom, and had concluded was probably wisdom. Doris was holding an empty plate. "I could smell something through the floor," she said. "Please tell me you have bread." Lydia had 2 loaves on the counter, cooling under dish towels, the way her own mother had always cooled bread, in the belief that bread cut too soon got gummy. One was for the week, one was planned for Thursday. "Come in," Lydia said. She cut Doris a slice and watched her eat it standing at the counter, which was how Doris ate most things, standing up, in a hurry even when she had nowhere to be. "Lydia," Doris said, "how much do you want for a loaf?" "You can just have it." "I don't want it given. What do you charge?" Lydia opened her mouth to say nothing, which was the true answer and the one she had prepared. And then she looked at the table, where the green folder sat face down with the red line through her medication costs. She looked at the empty Maxwell House can. She looked at her hands, which were still faintly dusted with flour because she hadn't quite finished washing them. $8, she said, and was surprised to hear herself say it. Doris pulled a 10 from her pocket without hesitating. "Keep the change." She picked up the loaf. "I'm going to tell people." "Doris." But Doris was already in the hallway. Block 2. Doris told people the way Doris did everything, efficiently and without consulting anyone. That evening, a post appeared in the Westward Arms Building Facebook group. "Homemade sourdough rye from the second floor, Lydia Marsh, $8 per loaf, worth every penny. Contact through the group." She had included a photo, taken with her phone in the hallway, of the loaf sitting on Lydia's counter just before she left. Lydia did not know this until the next morning, when her phone showed 4 messages from numbers she didn't recognize, and 2 from people in the building whose names she knew only from the mailbox labels in the lobby. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and read them slowly, the way she read anything unexpected, once for the words and once for what the words actually meant. What they meant was, people wanted bread. She called Ruth Hendricks that afternoon. Ruth had worked in the testo mixing department at Allied Grain for 28 years and now lived in Pekin, 30 miles north. And they spoke maybe twice a year and had never been close, the kind of relationship that consists entirely of Christmas cards and a shared past. But Ruth knew fermentation the way Lydia knew the lab, and the starter question was beyond what the torn card could answer. "Ruth, it's Lydia. Lydia Marsh, from Allied." "Lydia! Lord, it's been—" "I know. Ruth, quick question. I'm trying to run a rye sourdough starter from scratch. First 3 attempts died or went wrong. What am I missing?" Ruth was quiet for a moment, and Lydia heard something in the pause that she hadn't expected. A slight laugh, not unkind. "Lydia, you worked in the fermentation lab for 34 years. I know. You logged culture activity every single day. You know what a healthy starter looks like, smells like, what temperature it wants." "I know, but there's no but. You already know this. You're just not trusting it." Another pause. "What temperature is your kitchen?" "Cold. Building heat is unreliable." "Put it on top of the refrigerator. The compressor keeps it about 72 up there. Close enough. Use filtered water if you have it. The chlorine in tap water slows the culture. Equal parts flour and water by weight, not volume. And Lydia, don't check it every hour. You know what overmanaged fermentation looks like." She did. She had written reports on it. "Feed it once a day, discard half first. 4 days minimum before you expect anything. And don't smell it and panic. Weird smells are part of the process. You know this." "I know this," Lydia said. "Then trust it." She started the 4th attempt that afternoon, doing it methodically the way she had done everything in the lab. Filtered water from the Brita pitcher, flour weighed on the kitchen scale she had almost sold at the church rummage sale last year, temperature noted in the margin of the recipe card. She set the jar on top of the refrigerator and did not open it for 24 hours. On the 5th day, it was alive. She saw it before she opened the lid. The surface was domed. The sides of the jar showed old bubble tracks. And when she lifted the cloth she had draped over the top, the smell that rose was sharp and clean and alive. faintly sour in the way that good rye bread is faintly sour, and it hit her somewhere behind the sternum in a way she hadn't expected. Frank had wheeled himself to the kitchen doorway. She carried the jar over and held it near him. He breathed in slowly. The right corner of his mouth, the dropped one, the one that had been still for weeks, moved. Just slightly. The shadow of what it used to do. "There it is," Lydia said. The first real loaf came out of the oven on a Thursday. She let it cool for an hour under a dish towel while she sat on the kitchen stool and listened to it creak as it settled. A sound that was the same sound she had heard for 34 years in the Allied cooling room. The sound of a good loaf contracting as the crust stabilised. She cut it and brought a slice to Frank and stood in the doorway while he ate it. He chewed slowly on the left side of his mouth and looked at her, and his lips moved. "Good," he managed. It came out as one syllable, rough-edged but clear enough. That week she began taking orders. She kept a list in the same green folder on a new page. Names, number of loaves, day of pickup. She priced everything at $9, which felt less like a decision and more like the number she was able to say without her voice going strange. Helen Pratt from 1B was the second customer. Diabetic, small dog of indeterminate terrier lineage named Biscuit, who had a habit of appearing at Helen's ankles whenever food was in the vicinity. Helen wanted 2 loaves and asked 3 times whether there was any added sugar. There wasn't. There never was. Helen paid $18 in exact change, which she produced from a change purse that she snapped shut with the satisfaction of someone who has prepared for this specific transaction. Biscuit received a small piece of crust and sat in the hallway, looking in through the open door with an expression of patient optimism. The third week, a woman named Pam, from the building Facebook group, someone Lydia didn't know, asked for 3 loaves for a church social. Lydia said yes. She gave a pickup time. She did not ask for a deposit because asking felt presumptuous, and she still wasn't entirely sure she was a person who could ask. Pam didn't come. She didn't text, didn't call, didn't respond to Lydia's follow-up message the next day. The 3 loaves sat on the counter and got staler, and Lydia wrapped them in plastic and put them in the freezer, and did not take them back out. The flour alone on that order had cost $9.80. She stood at the counter for a while after she put the loaves in the freezer. Not crying, she had done something to her ability to cry somewhere between January and April that she couldn't quite account for. Just standing, hands flat on the counter, looking at the frost forming on the freezer door. Frank was at the kitchen table. He had been watching. "I should have asked for a deposit," Lydia said. He nodded. One nod, deliberate. "I know. I knew when I was saying yes that I should ask." She took her hands off the counter and dried them on the dish towel. "Next time I ask." She wrote it in the margin of her order page. 50% deposit up front. She underlined it twice, then added, "State it as a fact, not a question." 2 days later, Cheryl called. Lydia had not spoken to Gary since she put down the phone on Wednesday. Gary had not called back, which meant either he was hurt or he was letting her have the space she needed, or Cheryl had told him not to. She picked up on the second ring with the particular caution of someone expecting a specific kind of unpleasantness. Cheryl's voice had the quality of someone who has decided they are being reasonable. "Lydia, Gary told me about the bread thing." "The bread thing? People in the building are buying it. You're selling it." "That's right." "Lydia, do you understand how that looks? Gary works hard. We have a baby coming. If people think his mother has to sell bread out of her apartment because he's not—" "Cheryl," Lydia said, "I am going to stop you there." She said it quietly, the way you stop a conversation not by raising your voice, but by removing all the air from it. I sold bread because I know how to make it and people wanted it. That has nothing to do with Gary. She paused. I hope you feel better. Good night. She put the phone down and looked at it for a moment. From the living room came the sound of Frank's wheelchair moving slowly toward the door. He appeared in the doorframe and looked at her. His left hand was resting on the chair arm. He lifted it and pointed at her. Then he said, working it out word by word, with the effortful precision of someone assembling something heavy. Bake. Just the one word. Lydia looked at him. I know, she said. She turned back to the counter and began measuring flour. The next afternoon, Doris knocked again, this time with a notepad. Carol Fenn from 4C, her father-in-law passed, memorial lunch on Saturday, family coming in from Bloomington and Springfield. She wants 8 loaves. Doris looked up. She'll pay up front, half now, half on delivery. I told her that was your policy. It was not yet Lydia's policy. She had written it in a margin but had not yet applied it. But she decided at that moment that it was. Tell her yes, Lydia said. I need the measurements for what size event she's feeding, and half up front. Block 3. Carol Fenn came up the next evening with $42 in cash and a piece of paper with the details. 32 people, mostly older, mostly from downstate. The family had been big bread eaters. Her father-in-law would have liked this. She handed Lydia the cash, and Lydia put it in the Maxwell House can without counting it in front of her, which felt more professional. After Carol left, Lydia sat at the table and worked out the production plan. 8 loaves. Her oven held 3 at a time. 3 batches across Friday. First batch in at 5 a.m., done by 7. Second at 9, done by 11. Third at 2 p.m., done by 4. That gave her enough cooling time before the 8 o'clock handoff. Flour cost. 4 bags, $18.40. Electric. She had calculated her oven's cost per hour at about 30 cents. 3 bakes, 2 hours each, roughly $3.60. Total cost of goods, $22. Revenue, $84 once Carol paid the second half. Net, $62. She set an alarm for 4:30, made the first batch of dough Thursday evening, shaped the loaves Friday morning at 4, had the first 3 in the oven by 5:15. The apartment smelled like a bakery before the building had woken up. The first 2 batches came out clean. She set them on the cooling rack with the dish towels over them and started the third batch at 2 o'clock. 2 hours of proofing, then into the oven at 4. She had cleared the kitchen table to use as additional cooling space. 6 loaves in a row, wrapped in clean dish towels, smelling of rye and the particular warmth that a good loaf holds for 2 hours after it comes out. She put the third batch into the oven and turned the dial. And the oven made a sound. Not the usual sound, not the tick of the thermostat or the low hum of the element warming. A different sound. A sharp pop from somewhere behind the back panel, followed by a brief smell of something electrical, like a wire getting too hot. And then the interior light went dim and the low hum stopped. Lydia pulled the oven door open. Dark inside. Elements cold. She turned the dial back and forth. Nothing. She checked the breaker. Fine. She pulled the oven slightly from the wall and looked at the back panel. Nothing visible. She stood in the kitchen with her hands at her sides and looked at 2 loaf pans of raw dough and understood that the lower heating element had burned out. She called Walt Greer from 3A, who had retired from 26 years as an HVAC tech and who fixed things in the building in exchange for what he called neighbourly appreciation, which in practice meant home-cooked meals and help with his taxes in April. Walt arrived in 8 minutes with a flashlight and a screwdriver. He was quiet while he looked at it. Then he said, "Lower element's gone. I can order the part. GE still makes them for this model, but it's a week, maybe 10 days on delivery. New range you could get at the Habitat Restore, They had a couple last month, maybe $80 if you're lucky. But that's tomorrow morning, and it might be gone. Lydia looked at the clock on the microwave. 8:14 p.m. Carol was picking up at 8 a.m. 6 loaves done, 2 pounds of dough on the counter. Walt looked at the dough pans. How long before that's no good? An hour and a half, maybe 2? It's already proofed. Walt nodded slowly. He had the manner of someone who solves problems not by panicking, but by going through options in order. You got family in the building with an oven? I don't want to knock on doors at 8 o'clock. You got someone you could call? Lydia stood in the kitchen and thought about who she could call at 8 p.m. on a Friday night and ask to borrow an oven. Frank was watching from the doorway. His left hand moved, slowly, deliberately, and pointed at the wall phone by the cabinet. The landline she kept because Frank's emergency button was connected to it. I'm not calling Gary, Lydia said. Frank shook his head. Not Gary. He pointed again. His lips moved. Carol? Lydia guessed. He nodded. Lydia found Carol's number on the piece of paper she'd left. 3 rings. Carol, it's Lydia Marsh. I have a problem and I need to be honest with you. She said it the way Frank would have said it, directly, without preamble, a problem stated as a problem. She explained. 6 loaves done, oven failed, 2 pounds of dough with 90 minutes of life left in them. Carol was quiet for 4 seconds. Then, my sister Paula has a little countertop oven in her spare room. She never uses it. It's been in there since she moved from the condo. I can call her right now. 20 minutes later, Lydia was carrying the countertop oven from the 3rd floor. Paula's apartment, borrowed without Paula entirely understanding for what, and setting it on the kitchen table. It was a small appliance, a GE countertop model from the mid-90s, barely large enough to fit a 12-inch pizza. She found a loaf pan. It was 1 inch too wide. She looked at the pan, looked at the oven, looked at the dough, which was still rising and did not know about any of this. From the junk drawer, she pulled a piece of cardboard from the back of a notepad. She folded it to 3/4 inch thickness, which by trial and error she determined would hold the oven door open just enough to accommodate the extra inch of the pan, without either crushing the dough or letting out so much heat that it wouldn't bake. She taped the cardboard prop to the door hinge with masking tape, tested it. The oven door hung open approximately 1 inch even, stable. She slid in the pan. Walt, who had been watching all of this from the kitchen doorway, with the expression of a man who has seen improvised solutions his whole career, said, "That might actually work." "It will work," Lydia said. The first loaf took 48 minutes instead of 40 because the door was cracked. She tested it the way her mother had taught her. Knock the bottom, listen for hollow. And it was done. She set it to cool and loaded the second pan. By 12:40 a.m., both loaves were on the cooling rack. 8 loaves. 6 from the GE range that had worked for 36 years and finally hadn't. 2 from a borrowed countertop oven held open with a piece of cardboard from a notepad. Every one of them correct. Lydia sat on the kitchen stool and looked at her hands. They were red from the oven heat, dusted with flour at the knuckles, and she was so tired she could feel it behind her eyes. She was not happy exactly, and not proud exactly. She felt the thing you feel when you have been given a problem and solved it, and the solving used everything you had. A kind of empty steadiness. Frank had been awake through all of it. He was at the table now, and he was looking at her with what she recognised as his engineering expression, assessing, calibrating. And then he did something she had not seen him do since January. With considerable effort, working against the right side weakness, he raised his right hand a few inches off the armrest. Not far, not enough to wave, but up. Lydia looked at him. "Go to sleep," she said. "I'll be there in a minute." Carol came at 8 a.m. She opened the bag and smelled the first loaf and looked at Lydia with the expression people have when they were worried about something and the worry turned out to be unnecessary. She paid the remaining $42 and said at the door, "My sister wants a loaf. Can she get on your list?" After Carol left, Lydia went back to the kitchen and sat with the Maxwell House can and counted. 84 from the order, minus 18.40 in flour, 3.60 in electric, the $2 she estimated for the borrowed oven's electric use. Net, $60 even. Not what she'd planned, but close. That afternoon, Walt stopped by. He had his phone out. Facebook Marketplace, Decatur, GE Electric Range 2018, $80. Ladies moving, wants it gone by Sunday. I can borrow my nephew's truck. He looked at Lydia. Say the word. Not yet, Lydia said. 1 month. She got out the green folder and opened to a clean page, not the expenses page, a new page. She wrote at the top, goals. Below it, used range, $80. Target, June. She underlined it twice, the way she underlined everything that was a commitment rather than a wish. Then she went back to the starter, which had been sitting on top of the refrigerator through all of this, patient and alive, bubbling quietly under its cloth, indifferent to broken ovens and borrowed appliances and everything else that had happened in the kitchen, while it did its slow, biological work. Block 4. The phone rang at 12:20 a.m. Lydia was still at the kitchen table, too tired to have made it to bed yet, drinking a glass of water and looking at nothing in particular. Unknown number, 217 area code, Decatur. She answered it the way you answer a phone at midnight, when the person you worry about most lives in the next room, fast, already tense. Mrs. Marsh, this is Dr. Renee Okafor. I'm your husband's neurologist at St. Mary's. I'm sorry to call so late. I just finished rounds. I want to ask you something a little unusual. Frank had been at St. Mary's for a follow-up the previous week. Lydia had sent a half loaf with him in his bag, wrapped in a dish towel, tucked between his slippers and his change of clothes. He was going to be there overnight, and she knew how hospital food was. Your husband brought bread, Dr. Okafor said. Rye sourdough. The nursing staff found it. I hope that was all right. Mrs. Marsh, by noon, half the floor had eaten a piece. One of the nurses brought a slice to my office. I want to be honest with you. I assumed it was from a bakery, a good one. I asked Frank where it came from and he… A pause, and Lydia heard the smile in it. He was very clear that his wife made it. It took him a little while to tell me, but he was very clear. Lydia looked at the Maxwell House can on the counter. She was not sure what she felt. Something that wasn't quite surprise. Our cafeteria has a supply problem, Dr. Okafor said. The bread from the commercial supplier is, well, I think Frank would say the word he used to me, which was… Another pause. He said, bad, very emphatically, one syllable, very clear. That sounds like him. We serve about 80 patients a day and we go through a lot of bread and almost nobody eats it. The cafeteria director has been looking for a local supplier for months. I know this is an unusual call and I know it's midnight, but Mrs. Marsh, could you supply us? 15 loaves a week, Wednesdays. We'd pay $11 a loaf, direct to your account, end of month. Lydia sat very still. She did the math in her head the way she had done math for the past 4 months, automatically, silently, the way breathing is silent. 15 loaves at $11, $165 a week. Minus flour at roughly $25, minus electric at $4.50, minus maybe $2 in miscellaneous. Cost of goods, $31.50. Net per week, $133. Per month, $532. Plus the neighbourhood orders, she had been netting close to $280 a month from regular customers, and that number was growing. Total monthly income from bread, around $800. plus the $2,600 from Social Security, total $3,400. Expenses $2,550, plus her own blood pressure medications, which she had not been buying, $175. Surplus $675 a month. She opened her eyes. She had not realized she had closed them. "My oven broke tonight," she said. "I can't start this week." "How long do you need?" "1 week." "I can wait 1 week. But I need to show the cafeteria director results. After that, she'll go back to the commercial supplier." "1 week is enough," Lydia said. She put the phone down. Frank was in the doorway. He had been there for a while. She hadn't heard him come. He was looking at her with that same grey, patient look. "St. Mary's wants bread," she said. 15 loaves a week." He nodded once, as if this was the natural conclusion of a sequence of events that had been building toward it. "I told her my oven was broken." He made a sound, a soft, short sound that in another context she would have called a laugh. "Don't," she said, but she was almost smiling. In the morning, she went down to Walt's apartment at 7:30. He answered the door in a bathrobe. "That range on Marketplace," she said. "Can you go today?" He looked at her for a moment. "I thought you said 1 month." "I moved the timeline up." He got his nephew's truck. By noon, the GE range, white, 2018, barely used, $80, was in Lydia's kitchen, and Walt was connecting it while Lydia stood to the side, reading the instruction manual she hadn't been given because it was a used appliance, which meant she was reading the same manual online on her phone. They tested it together. Walt set a temperature. They waited. The interior light held steady. The element came on evenly. Walt stuck his hand in. "Clean heat," he said. "Good unit." That afternoon, Lydia sat down with Walt at the kitchen table and they registered her as a sole proprietor. It was not the 5-minute process she had been led to expect. It was closer to 2 hours, including the time Walt spent holding her phone steady while she typed with 2 fingers, and the 20 minutes they lost because she kept getting logged out of the IRS website. Walt drank 3 cups of coffee and did not complain. Frank sat at the table too and watched, occasionally pointing at the phone when he could see that Lydia had pressed the wrong thing. At the end of it, she was registered. She had a business name, LM Bread, which was not a name she had chosen so much as the first thing she had typed, and she understood that she would owe self-employment tax quarterly and that the cafeteria would need an invoice. She wrote the word invoice on the inside cover of the green folder so she would remember to look up how to make one. She wrote the new budget on a fresh page of the folder. Social Security, both, $2,600. Bread income net, approximately $800. Total, $3,400. Expenses, $2,550. Her own medications, $175. Revised balance, plus $675 per month. She looked at the $675 for a long time. Not because it was a large number, it wasn't, but because it meant that in the column where she had drawn a red line through her own name, she could write something else. She took the red pen and crossed out the red line. Then she took a blue pen and wrote above it, carefully, amlodipine plus lisinopril, monthly, paid. Gary called 3 days later. Lydia saw his name and answered on the first ring, which was new. "Mum, Dr. Okafor mentioned the bread when I brought Dad in for his PT evaluation." "I know, she called me." "Why didn't you tell me what was happening?" Lydia thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because you weren't calling." A long pause. The television in the background, not cartoons this time, the news. "Mum, I'm sorry, I didn't know how bad it was. I thought you were managing." "Yeah." "I was," Lydia said. "I am." But it helps to not be alone in it. Another pause, longer. Can I come Sunday? I want to see Dad. Yes, come Sunday. I'll have fresh bread. He arrived at noon, alone. Lydia heard the knock, and when she opened the door, Gary was standing in the hallway, with a paper grocery bag in his arms, and the expression of a man who has had a lot of time in the car to think about things. He came in and put the bag on the counter, and Lydia looked in it. A £5 bag of King Arthur bread flour and, underneath, a £20 bag of King Arthur rye. She looked at it for a moment. Ruth said that's the brand you'd want, he said. You called Ruth? Dr. Okafor gave me her number. She said she knew someone who worked with you. He paused. Ruth said you were the best person at Allied who knew what made bread work. She said you understood it the way most people understand their native language. Lydia didn't say anything. She put the kettle on. Gary sat at the kitchen table. Frank wheeled himself in and stopped at the end of the table, and the two of them looked at each other for a moment. Frank at Gary, Gary at Frank. With the particular silence that exists between people who have been avoiding something and have arrived at the moment of not avoiding it anymore. Gary reached across the table. Frank lifted his left hand and put it in Gary's hand. Gary's jaw moved. He looked out the window at the parking lot, where there was nothing particular to look at, and then he looked back. I'm sorry, Dad, he said. Frank squeezed his hand. That was enough. They ate bread and drank tea, and Gary stayed for 3 hours and said nothing about Springfield, and nothing about facilities, and nothing about Cheryl. Before he left, he asked if there was anything he could do, and Lydia said, Learn how to make an invoice. Gary looked at her. In Excel, I need to bill the hospital. I can do that tonight and email it to you. Good. He left, and Lydia heard his car pull out of the lot, and then it was quiet in the apartment, in the particular way it was quiet when something that had been strained between people was no longer strained. She went to the kitchen. The starter was on top of the refrigerator, where it had been since the beginning, bubbling steadily in its jar. She took it down and set it on the table next to the recipe box. She opened the box and found the torn card. Ruth Marsh, 1941. Feed it every morning. And she turned it over. She found a pen. She thought for a moment about what the rest of the sentence had said, in the kitchen of a woman who had been dead for over 20 years, and she wrote, Feed it every morning. It needs you. She capped the pen, put the card back in the box, closed the lid. Outside, it was a Thursday in May, the kind of May Day that makes you forget what February was like, which is probably its purpose. Lydia went to the window and looked at the parking lot, which had not changed and was not scenic, and at the sky, which was doing something ordinary and blue. The starter sat on the table behind her, alive and rising, as it would tomorrow, and the day after, and Wednesday when she would load 3 canvas bags and take the bus to St. Mary's with 15 loaves wrapped in dish towels. Frank came to the kitchen doorway. She turned. Do you want some bread? She said. He nodded. She cut 2 slices, thick ones, and buttered them. Real butter, Land O'Lakes, which was back on the grocery list, and put his on the plate she had used for this purpose since January, the one with the small chip in the rim that she kept meaning to throw away and never did. She handed it to him, and he took it with his left hand and looked at it and then at her, and the right corner of his mouth, that stubborn, half-paralyzed corner, lifted. Not all the way, but enough. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday in May, Lydia stood at the Walgreens pharmacy counter on El Dorado Street and put everything in the basket. Her pills, both of them, Frank's new supplement the cardiologist had added, and from the end-of-aisle display, a chocolate bar. She paid with her debit card and did not calculate first. The pharmacist asked if she wanted her receipt, and she said yes, and put it in her pocket and walked out into the May sunshine and sat in the car for a moment. Not because she was sad or tired or needed to collect herself, but because it was a warm day and there was no reason to rush. She had bread to make when she got home. Wednesday delivery. The starter was on the refrigerator. The new oven was waiting. There were worse things to be in a hurry toward. If you are looking at your retirement and thinking that the thing you spent decades learning, at a factory, at a school, at a lab, in a kitchen, wherever your work took you, is over now, is past its time, has no place in what comes next, look again. What you know is not archived. It is not retired. It is the same as it ever was, and the world still needs it. And very often, the person closest to it, you, is the last one to see its value. Lydia was a fermentation technician. She tested bread cultures for 34 years. She did not think of it as anything special. She was wrong. What she learned from the bread and what she wanted us to know is this. The first time someone offers to pay you for something you have always given away for free, say yes. Price it honestly. Take a deposit. Learn one new thing about your own work. In her case, how to register as a sole proprietor, how to write an invoice. And do not let the learning stop you from starting. The technical parts come after the bread is baking, not before. If you have found a way to turn what you know into what you need, tell us about it in the comments. Lydia reads them. She is usually in the kitchen when she does. Like this post so that those who need to see this story right now will see it. And subscribe. Here we share stories about people who stopped being shy and started making money doing what they do best.